Sometimes a photo just stops you in your tracks, and that was definitely the case with this scene. I was scrolling through Facebook and saw this gorgeous landscape that a friend had posted. She was kind enough to let me paint it, and in this video I'll be showing you how to paint it too. Thank you, Emma, for sharing this amazing snippet of beautiful English countryside and for letting us all have a go at recreating it. The colours I'll be using for this are Winsor & Newton's Primary Yellow, their Primary Red, Ultramarine, Cobalt Turquoise Light, plus Payne's Grey and Titanium White. I'm working in my little Etcher Everyday Sketchbook, and I have my favourite 4 brushes to hand. These are the 1/2 inch angled shader, size 8 filbert, size 4 round, and the size 2 liner brush. These are Kingart Original Gold Series brushes, and they're beautiful for painting with gouache. We'll begin with the sky, and we don't need all our colours out just yet. Here I have a blob of ultramarine, Payne's Grey and the white. The Payne's Grey is just a personal preference. If you don't have it, black will work just fine. Subtlety is the name of the game with this sky. We want to capture the brightest spot, but also the hints of some darker cloud bottoms. Don't overthink a sky like this. Use a nice big brush to apply the colours roughly and then smooth them together. The bright spot should be just white, with a little pale blue along the upper edge of the page and down the left side. Over on the right we can have more grey in the mix for the stormy clouds. Don't worry too much here about your grey being too dark. I like to add the grey to the page in roughly the right location and then fuss a little with the brush to blend this colour back into the surrounding paler clouds. We don't need to worry too much about this whole right side. The big tree will go here and cover most of this up. But if you find it distracting to leave this little bit of bare page, go ahead and bring your sky colours across here too. I finished off the sky here by reinforcing the shadowy greys of the clouds with just the tip of the brush. If you work with very little paint on your brush at a time, the bristles become a double-use tool. First, to apply the paint, and secondly, once the paint has run out, a blending tool to soften marks and textures. Next, we'll move on to the most distant trees. So I'm adding some primary yellow to the palette. The greens back here will have plenty of white and a little black in them. You can see here how I'm mixing this green over the little bit of grey left on the palette. We want these colours to be a little washed out and greyed. This is going to help to push them back into the distance. We don't want them competing with the vibrant greens that we'll add to the foreground. I'm still using the wide flat brush for this and rough little marks to add paint and dimension in one go. All these little bits of the paper showing through will give us ideas of where to pick out the light and shadows in these trees. Also, make the top edge nice and scruffy. We want to give the impression of the outer branches of the trees here, and they wouldn't be completely solid. A few nice gaps letting the sky peep through will help to give them a natural, airy feel. A little more blue added to the mix creates a shadowy green, perfect for along the bottom, and in a few little shadows tucked in the layers. But these details are tiny and they're only going to sit in the very back of the painting, so don't drive yourself mad with details here. Underneath this, we can begin to add this bright section of grass. We want this to be much more vibrant, so that calls for a green with a lot of yellow in it. This primary yellow that I'm using here is a really nice cool yellow, but the blue that I have, ultramarine, this is a warm blue. And what this means is that although the green is more vibrant than the colour we use for the trees in the background, it's not quite the right flavour. We need a cool blue to mix with our cool yellow for that colour, and that's what the cobalt turquoise is for. But this little area of green helps us to mark out where the background trees on the left will come down to and where the wall will come up to at the bottom. Now, the ultramarine and the yellow might be a little dull for the grass, but they mix together perfectly to create a wonderful deep green that'll work great for picking out the shapes of these closer background trees. Still using the wide flat brush, I promise we will use a different brush eventually. Load a little of this dark colour onto a nearly dry brush, so one that you've wiped well on a paper towel. Then you can use the pointed corner of the brush to create this treetop texture. Fill in this area all the way down to the bottom where it meets the grass. To begin to pick out the lighter upper branches of this cluster of trees, I'm adding a little white and yellow to this dark mixture. Again, I only have a little paint loaded onto the brush, so I can kind of skip the brush around and let the texture of the paper grab the paint unevenly. It gives us that nice airy texture, which is perfect for treetops. For a little extra control with this large brush, I've turned it so I can just use the point, but you could always switch to a smaller round brush if you prefer. Here I'm adding a little more yellow in this mixture to begin to warm the colour up, just for those bits of the tree that are catching a little of that warm summer light, so around the tops of the tree shapes, and a little glazed over this other green. We want lots of little variations in the greens here. Okay, so I'm finally going to switch to a smaller brush. This is a size 2 liner, and this will be perfect for just tucking a few trunks around the edge of all these trees. A little grey is fine for this, and make a mixture that'll show up over the dark green. Don't get too fussy with these marks though, as they'll only peep through the foreground layers. We have this little stripe of dark green space along the base of the trees, where not much light is getting in, but let's use a green that's just a touch lighter than the dark colour here and drop in a little texture with the brush tip. These few simple marks make it look like there's more bushes and little trees tucked under here that we can't quite see, and it adds interest to an otherwise boring flat bit of dark green. So I'm making a little space on my palette here so we can introduce some cobalt turquoise light. This is going to give us those nice vibrant greens for the grass in the centre. Mixed with the yellow, it certainly packs a punch, but we can rein this in slightly with a warmer blue, the ultramarine. And I'm using my size 4 round brush now to mark in these long shadows reaching away from the trees. And the turquoise in the mixture really gives this green a nice vibrant contrast against the other duller greens used for the trees. Now let's brighten up that sunlit grass. The yellow with a little turquoise for that super saturated green, and I'm just going to add this over the whole grassy area. I've also used just a tiny bit of the darker mixture to add some bits of texture with the brush tip. Little dips or bits of shadows out in the field. At this stage the background is finished. We can just check it over and see if we want to make any little adjustments before we move on to the foreground. And I'm just going to add a little more airy height to these trees on the left here. Little clusters of branches reaching up that don't have any shadows behind them. And this is a pale green from yellow, ultramarine and white for this. Now we are ready to dive into those foreground details, the wall, the trees, and all the little plants and grasses that frame this beautiful view. All the colours we use here are going to be much more saturated than in the background, so not as much white adding to the mixtures. We want these colours to feel different to the background colours to separate the layers and create a sense of depth. We'll start with a really nice dark mixture for the wall. We want a lively mix here though, something that's going to capture the subtle colours in the shadows. Here I'm mixing a little blue, a little red, some black and a little yellow for like a dark purpley black. And I'm back with my beloved angled shader to pick out that top edge of the wall. The pointy corner does a great job of creating these sharp, irregular shapes. And then you can fill down to the bottom of the page underneath here. So we've got this kind of little wedge-shaped dark wall. Now, for the rocky details here, we're going to cheat a little. We don't want to get bogged down in all the tiny details of each stone, so we'll use a cluster of angular marks to imply more detail than we paint. A little white lightens the mixture, and the pointy corner of the brush is perfect for capturing one side of each rock across the top. Just a little dab of the brush to make a nice angular shape, and making them smaller towards the right to show the perspective. A little black and ultramarine together make a dark blue that we can place in for some deep shadows. I'm using the brush here to carve this colour in between the lighter bands to accentuate these top rocks. You can also add a few dashes of this colour lower down the wall. Now we want to pick out the tops of a few rocks that are catching the warm light. I've made a little pale orange here and mixed it with the purple on the palette to dull it slightly. And with my liner brush, I can just pick out the tops of a few stones. I want a little more saturation in this colour, so I'm using a more vibrant orange mix to just brush over the top of a few of the stones and these lighter marks. And honestly, this kind of detail I kind of do with one eye looking at it. Sometimes we can get too focused on fussy details and we lose the big picture. These little rocky details only need to be good enough, so don't drive yourself mad fussing at them. Think, what would Bob do? Bob would definitely call them happy little rocks and move on. For the foreground greenery, we can add the appropriate shape and location with a nice shadowy green. This is blue, black and yellow for a dull mixture that's going to sit behind all of our details. Use this to cover the remaining white of the page with your trusty wide-angled shader. And as you go, you can brighten this mix up a little with some yellow. This is useful for the brighter spots of grass, especially the ones above the wall on the right side. When you're adding these greens, just roughly blend the different shades together. Nothing needs to be smooth here. Over on this left side, I'm ready to add the cluster of tree trunks. And we're back to the dark purple for this, so blue, red and a little black. I'm not worried about this colour being too dark because I can always go over the top with some highlights to lift it and create texture. I'm using my small filbert brush for these trees and creating a mixture of different thicknesses and some branches. At the bottom, I'm finishing the trunks in different spots. We'll add a little grass and some plants down here, so don't worry too much about this bottom edge. Your rightmost tree should have a little of that bright white in the sky in the background to the right of it, where we can add a bright branch, so keep this in mind when you're adding your trunks. I want to capture the brightness in the sky burning through the little branch at the side of this tree, and for that I'm going to use some orange. This is red and yellow with just a little white and dulled with a little of the purple. And I'm using my liner brush to paint in the branch, leaving it blank over that brightest spot of sky. We can also use a little vibrant orange mix to kind of glaze over the bigger part of the trunk. At the edges you get these nice peeps of sun illuminated trunk, and on the darker parts we get the impression of a nice warm glow. Join your hovering branch to your tree with a little palest orange, smoothing the sections together and blending this lighter colour out into the surrounding orange. Add just a little paint at a time here and allow it to dry between applications to avoid making a mess. A couple of layers of white gouache finish off this brightest spot. On the nearest bit of the main trunk, I'm going to use a little of the pale orange to create kind of like a halo of glow here, and just blend this out into the surrounding dark wood. Now we can add the smaller limbs, and for these I've gone with a warm brown, so red and yellow darkened with a little blue. I added plenty of red to this mix. And I've also used this to warm up the right edges of the closest trunks, using my liner brush for small swipes and then switching to the filbert for larger swathes of colour. I want to bring out some of the texture on the trunks, and for this I'll lighten the dark purple still on my palette with a little white. I'm just going to dry brush this on for lots of that lovely texture. Don't worry if some of your marks look a little too bold. We can make this more subtle by dry brushing a little of the dark purple over the top. This is especially useful around the edges of the trunks and at the base to create that gradual curve of the bark into the shadows. Let's add some plants growing up and around these trunks. This can be a green made with a little of both blues and some yellow. The yellow in there will mean this colour lightens as it dries, so you might want to test it out before adding it to the page. I'm using the round brush and painting these little ovals and sweeping the brush down just as I lift it off the page. It gives it a little point at the bottom, kind of like a leaf growing towards us. I've added these around the front of all these trees, using more yellow in the mix where they grow up the trees on the right, and a little more Prussian blue for the more shadowy plants towards the edge of the page. You can adjust your greens to create overlapping shapes. Pick darker leaves over the lighter greens and pop a few lighter greens peeping out of the shadowy grasses. A version of this green that has lots more yellow in there is perfect for a few spots of greenery that is just catching the sun. And when you do this, you want to add these marks over areas that are darker in the background. We need the darkness behind to show the contrast of the lights over the top. Just a few little artful blobs with the brush here. Less is more for these most striking details, but always popping them over the darkest areas behind. With our brightest lights in place, I want to add in a few deep shadows, so a dark green, pretty much any green you still have on your palette with a little black in there, and squish it in around the base of all these plants. Some of this dark green will also work great for the upper tree foliage on this side, and with only a little paint on a mostly dry brush, we can use the texture of the surface to catch a little paint and make this step really easy. So for this little area on the right, we have all of this dense foliage with lots of little peeps of bright green showing through. So we'll add this in first. That way we'll get a much brighter result than if we tried to add this green over all the darker colours at the end. This is yellow and the cobalt turquoise, and I'm using the round brush to just scrub this onto the page in little natural clusters, building up the overall silhouette of these trees. Once I have a good amount of the light green in place, I'll use a darker mixture from the yellow and Prussian blue for some normal greens. And I'm still just scrubbing this on. Any texture created like this is going to be detail that we don't have to add with lots of little brush strokes. Darken this green up again for the thickest spots of trees. And at this stage we can begin to obscure a little of that super bright green, leaving just a handful of brighter spots showing through. Look at this area through unfocused eyes to check the overall distribution of lights and darks. We have other things to add here, so good enough is good enough for now. A little of this darker colour can be used to add some shadowy grasses and textures down here at the bottom. We want there to be lots of little shadowy spots and textures, so I'm just using a small amount of paint at a time and scrubbing it on in these random ways to make this area interesting and varied. I want a bright little plant tucked behind this wall here, one that the sun is just touching over the top. So we need a bright yellow-green again for this, and just a collection of small marks over this dark spot of wall. Below this, let's add a sprinkle of cow parsley, a little bit of white, and just the very tip of the brush to make all these little groups of white flowers spread out along the wall. In all this green space underneath, we can give the impression of busy grasses. A splayed brush, so one where you press the base of the bristles until they spring apart at the tip, will allow you to paint several fine lines all at once. And you can do this in a mixture of lighter and darker greens to pick out those grasses in light and to push back those in shadow. We have all this green for the tree over on the right here, so we'd better add in a trunk and some branches. A dark brown made from red, yellow, and a little black will work here. And we want a liner brush so we can add in plenty of smaller branches. When you do this, you want to create these broken lines, leaving gaps where the limbs disappear behind dense foliage. And we want to make sure that all this green that we've added is supported by a web of branches that taper off towards the outer edges of the tree. Our final addition to this tree is the deepest shadows, where no light is getting through the thicker parts. This is mostly black with just a touch of yellow to turn it slightly to green. And like we did when we added the first green layers here, I'm kind of unfocusing my eyes to evaluate these dark areas, adding little marks until I'm happy. Around the base of these trees, I'm going to pop in a few blobs of paint in a lighter green, just to pick out the shapes of a few plants growing here. And then some darker shapes on the lighter green. We want that contrast between light and shadow to see these details. The last step of any painting is to take a step back and give your eyes a break. This is normally the time I'll go and make a cup of tea. When you've been working up close on something for so long, you kind of lose a little perspective of the big picture. So a tea break allows us to get this back. Then with fresh eyes, we can make decisions of any final adjustments that we want to make to the scene. Here I've taken a clean damp brush and just blurred the lighter spots of the tree foliage to give them kind of a glowy effect. I've added just a touch more foliage hanging down from the tree on the left, and I've added a few deeper shadowy marks in the darker areas of the scene to finish off this rendition of Emma's view.